terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchangeable. So, quizzes part 1, deadline today, at end of day. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, October 19th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th, the day that shall live in infamy. And for the paper, draft deadline, November 9th, +5 deadline, November 14th, merge deadline, November 21st, and of course, desperation deadline, December 8th, the day after the day that shall live in infamy. Before pressing on to finishing up our good dead friend Socrates, and then heading into our ventures in part 2, philosophy and religion, anything about the stuff so far, the paper or any other stuff that needs more stuff. Okay, so now we turn to the end of our, well, almost the end of our good dead friend Socrates, and we saw that he's been sentenced to death, and his friends are upset and say, "Oh, Socrates, don't die." And he tries to soothe them by presenting the argument that death is nothing to fear. And as we saw, this takes the form of a classic dilemma. If P then R, if Q then R, P or Q, therefore R. And it's a valid deductive argument. So in terms of the quality of the reason deductively, it of course is flawless. If this is true, and this is true, and this is true, then the conclusion must be true. And so since it's valid, the question then is the premise, the key question, the disjunction, one or the other, is that premise actually true? And as we saw, this is most likely a classic case of a false dilemma, where a person advances two choices as if they're the only two, and then says, well, in this case it's going to be one or the other. But of course there are many other options. As we saw, something like hell or a hell-like place, perhaps New Jersey, would be an option. And then of course you could imagine things that are not as bad as hell, but not so great, like being reincarnated as a banana slug, or like in Beetlejuice, where you're just kind of stuck in a waiting room for a long time, or other things that are, not hellish, but kind of unpleasant. And so it would seem false dilemma. Now you may wonder, why would someone as smart as Socrates commit a false dilemma? Well, one reason is, of course, even smart people make mistakes. And of course, secondly, people who defend Socrates say, well, he's just trying to reassure his friends, and so his goal was not really a logical argument, but to make his friends feel better. So he continues on trying to make them feel better. He claims, and this is part of his reasoning as to why you should be good, namely that being good makes you unbreakable, which is this. He claims nothing evil can befall someone who is good, either while alive or after death. Now, given that he's being sent off to death, does that seem plausible? Well, does goodness protect one from evil? On one hand, yeah, because if you are good, then you can't be evil. And so, on one hand, kind of true. It's like someone who never lies can never be like a liar. So kind of true. But then again, looking at it, could bad stuff happen to good people? Yeah, it does seem like that. And Socrates himself is being led away to be put to death, and so seems kind of untrue. So what could he mean by this? Well, if it is that nothing, negative or unpleasant can happen to good people, clearly not true. Because all kinds of bad stuff happens to good people all the time, leading to the classic philosophical question, why do bad things happen to good people? But then for Socrates, there's a question of what actually counts as evil. Later thinkers, who are known as the Stoics, from which you get our term Stoicism, now developed this notion. Now today, when we say someone is a Stoic, what do we mean? You say, like, look at that person, life is, really pouring it on them, all this, They lost their house, they lost their car, but they're still sticking in there. What a Stoic. What do we mean? Yeah, they're strong. They don't give in to, disasters. They don't give in to, trouble. So later thinkers, the Stoics, they came up with this idea. People like, probably most famously, Marcus Aurelius. If you ever saw the old classic movie Gladiator, he's the fictional emperor. He was a real emperor, Marcus Aurelius, but in the movie he's portrayed fictional. The story's not, shockingly enough, in Hollywood, entirely true. And the Stoics had the view that nothing itself is either good or evil, but how we react to it. So our choice of how we respond to things determines what's good or bad. And Socrates kind of is a precursor here, that sure, a good person can be killed or have their property taken, but no evil can affect them if they're good, because it's up to them whether they're bad or not. And like he argues, he can't live forever, so his choice is be good or bad, because he can't choose to live forever, so he chooses to be good and dead. And similarly here, he thinks that, if you're a good person, sure, seeming lawful things can happen, but the choice of being good or evil is always in one's grasp. We can choose to be bad. Now, later thinkers, of course, were rather critical of this, noting that to say that a person would be having like a happy life or a good life when they're in a terrible misery and suffering is just absurd. Aristotle said basically that. But it's an interesting point. Again, the Stoics take the view that it is up to us how we respond to things, whether something is good or evil. And other people take the view that things themselves are good or bad based on how they affect us. And a good case could be made for either one. So Socrates once again refers to his little voice. It didn't say, Socrates, don't do that, so I think he's making the right choice. And he asks of his friends a favor, that if his sons act all pretentious, they should trouble his sons as he troubled others. And then he gives his parting speech, which is, it's time for him to leave, and only the gods know which way is better. Now, in terms of how his story ends, he's taken to prison and about to be sentenced to death. But there's a tradition, a ritual in the city of Athens. You might have heard the classic tale of the Minotaur, the famous half-bull, half-human, under the city of Minos, dwelling in the labyrinth of the maze. And the city of Athens used to pay a tribute to Minos in the form of sending youth there to be consumed by the Minotaur. It's kind of weird because bulls are herbivores, but I guess Minotaur is like a little meat. People snacks, I guess. And so this hero, Theseus, goes over, volunteers to go to do battle with the Minotaur. And he manages to, with the aid of the princess of Minos, and is able to escape. And then he comes back. Now, of course, since it's a Greek story, there's always going to be tragedy and death. So when the ship came back from Minos, if it had a black sail, that would indicate that they failed. They were all dead, except we'll come back, obviously. If there's a white sail, they'd survived. And they forgot to change the sail. So Theseus' father sees the black sail and despair and kills himself. And so Theseus triumphs and comes back and finds that his father is dead. Because the Greeks, lots of sadness. Which might explain why there's always drinking going on in all the dialogues. Now during this religious holiday, they send out a ship symbolically, and when it's away from Athens, there can be no executions in the city. It's delayed by a storm, so Socrates gets a delay in his execution. And of course, being Socrates, he spends his time in the dialogue with Crito talking about philosophy. His friends come to bust him out, and they bribe the guards, they get a boat waiting, but he refuses to go. He says that he's obligated to the state because he agreed to do so, and it'd be unjust for him to go back on his word. And at the end of the dialogue, he drinks the hemlock and dies slowly. And so that's how it ends, the story of Socrates. Until they retcon it in the new movie and change his origin story, where he gets bit by a radioactive, squirrel and Squirrel Socrates, who knows? Squirrel Girl is a real hero in the Marvel Universe, just for real. You can Google that, it's a thing. Squirrel Socrates, though, that'd be super cool. Trademark. Okay, before pressing on to part 2, anything about part 1, or radioactive squirrels, that needs any more stuff. Okay, part 2 is philosophy and religion. Now, we're looking at this predominantly from the Western standpoint, which of course is only part of the Buddhist tradition of the world, but it's kind of it evolves out of Greek philosophy, hence, we'll be looking at this. Now, the ancient Greeks, as we saw, they had, of course, religion. Everybody's got religion. And they had, essentially the poets laying out this religion, and then they had a polytheistic view, many gods. Then you see the rise of Judaism, which has monotheism, a single god, and then later, of course, Christianity. Now, one of the core sort of battles between and in philosophy and religion is this problem of faith and reason. Now, in Christianity, the challenge is this. On one hand, of course, there is respect for reason, arguments for things. But of course, there's also the matter of faith, where things are believed just because one has faith. Now, there are, of course, many classical questions here, such as which one should be believed, especially when they come into conflict. Do you accept faith or do you accept reason? And much of the philosophy of religion, especially during the Middle Ages, was that conflict. And different thinkers gave more weight to faith or less weight to faith. Now, there are some points of agreement and disagreement between sort of original Christianity, New Testament, and philosophy. Because when the New Testament was, many of the writings talking about the time period of Jesus was set, of course, during the Roman Empire. And philosophy was a big thing then. There's actually references to the Stoics and Epicureans and their interactions with Christianity. And so two of the competitors to Christianity were the Stoics and the Epicureans. Also the skeptics, as we'll see. And so, not surprisingly, the Bible has some agreement with philosophy, but also some disputes. Which means that if you read explicitly in the Bible, you find anti-philosophical views, but also pro-philosophical views, because during that time, they had to win over people who were Stoics or Epicureans or skeptics. Now, jumping ahead to the Middle Ages, 11th and 12th century, the battle again is kind of between these two circles. So you've got faith and reason. And the question is essentially, which one, put kind of ironically, do you put more faith in? If you're trying to find out the truth about things, is faith your true guide? Is reason your true guide? Or, in more practical things, which things fall under which? So if you want to know stuff, what do you use? Now, in some cases, there's quite a bit of agreement. For example, if you're trying to figure out how to, say, reset your smartphone, which probably works better, faith or reason? Yeah, because if you pray for your smartphone to be reset, God doesn't do that. That's the devil's business. He handles all smartphones. True story. Now, there were many thinkers who believed that reason should be predominant. They still accepted faith, but they favored reason. It included such well-known dead guys as John Scotus Erigena, Rosellin, and Avalon, who were of course also quite dead. Then there was a series of monastic reforms with people like Peter Damon and Saint Bernard who emphasized faith more. Now we'll be looking at some of the famous dead philosophers of religion, including our good dead friend St. Anselm, who believed the following view. Essentially, in a way, the circles kind of overlapped. He believed that every matter of faith could be proven through deductive logic. So you could believe through faith, but if you wanted to prove any of the religious claims, you could break out deductive logic and show with absolute certainty that they are true. Now, what he's best known for, in addition to being a saint and being dead, which in a way you're redundant, because in order to be a saint, you've got to be dead. So you see job applications for sainthood, probably not, because you have to be dead to qualify. So it's a trap. Now, his thing that he's known for is what's called the Ontological Argument, in which he tries to prove, through pure reason, that God not only exists, but that God must exist. We'll talk more of this later, but it wasn't enough for Anselm to simply prove that God exists. He's got to prove that God must exist, that God cannot not exist, and this only applies to God, which is kind of overkill, but it's worth doing, I suppose. It's worth doing in a sense. Now, our next big saint of philosophy is our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas, or Tom, as no one, I think, called him. He has a few high schools named after him. Now, he borrowed a lot from our good dead friend Aristotle, and he put a lot of faith in faith and also reason. He thinks, as we'll see, there are some areas that are for reason, some are for faith, and there's some overlap between the circles. And Thomas Aquinas is important because hugely influential on Christianity, also Western thought in general, so an important but very dead thinker. Now, as you might imagine, one of the big questions in philosophy of religion, especially in the West and also the East, any place that accepts monotheism, is the question of God. And whenever I'm like on a plane or at some party or something, and people find out I'm a philosopher, they always ask me about God. Because the first thing they usually ask is, oh, what do you do? And I say, philosopher. And they say, oh, do you believe in God? So now I just tell people I'm a drug dealer because the questions are better. Less shame. Now, one thing that people want to rush right to is, does God exist? And one thing I do when I'm asked, on a plane, seemingly annoyingly so, I'll always ask people, when they ask me, do you believe in God? I'll ask them back, what do you mean by God? And then they realize that I really am a philosopher because I'm asking annoying questions. And they'll say, well, God, the big guy. And I'll say, well, which one are you talking about? Old Testament, New Testament, Mormon God, Islam, which verse of Islam, what God are you talking about?
I was just about to ask, so when they say the nature of God, they mean God, all gods?
Yeah. Yeah, because there are, everyone says, if you ask a Muslim of any type, a Christian of any type, believe in God, everyone says, yeah. But then you ask them, what is this God like? What are his views on various issues? You'll get very different answers. Even as something as basic as ham. So if you ask someone, what does God feel about, well, I should say bacon, because there's also the biblical figure about bacon, BLTs. What's his stance on bacon? Now, of course, in Judaism, the answer is God hates that stuff. Pigs are dirty animals. Don't be putting that in your mouth. Same with Islam. Pigs are dirty animals. Don't be putting that in your mouth. Christianity? Well, it depends. Some sects, like Seventh-day Adventists, often believe that pigs are dirty animals. You shouldn't be putting that stuff in your mouth. But most other Christians point to, the Revised Version, the New Testament, which takes away those dietary restrictions, so bacon is okay. Same with lobster. If you're Old Testament, if you're Jewish or Muslim, shellfish would be a no-no if you buy the Old Testament. But the Revised Version is okay. And so the first question we have to ask before we can say, does God exist, is we have to answer the question, what is the nature of God? what is this being that we're talking about? What do we mean? And again, everybody just says, God. But if you look at the details about what people think about God, people have very different views about what God is, what God wants, what the rules are, and it makes a big difference. So to use an analogy, suppose you have a visitor from a faraway land like Canada or New Jersey, and they ask you, I am from faraway, New Jersey. Do you have glub here? You'd of course ask them, what is glub? Because if you don't know what it is, you have no idea whether it's here or not. So if someone says, does God exist? A fair question is, what do you mean by God? And everyone thinks they know the answer. They're like, the thing I believe in. But a fair question is, what is that? What is one asking about? Now even people who believe in God, again, differ about the nature of God. For example, one of the, and we'll see more of this later, one of the standard questions about God is, he's supposed to be all-powerful, omnipotent. But one thing is, what does that really mean? Now, in the Middle Ages, they got into such big fights about it, they actually came up with names for the two parties. And we'll see this in the future, but one party were called intellectualists. They believed that God's reason was supreme. That meant that God could do anything that was within the realm of logic. He couldn't do the impossible. So, could God make a round square? And they would say no, because it's impossible. Now, the other school are called voluntarists, not because they like volunteering for things, but because they believe God's will is supreme. And God could will anything, even the impossible. He could make triangles five-sided. It's not that they would be five-sided figures we call triangles, they'd be three-sided figures that are five-sided. How's that possible? It's not. But God could do it. So some people think God being all-powerful means that God could do anything, even the impossible. No limit to his powers. Others believe that God is all-powerful, which means he can do anything that can be done. And that would be maybe seemingly a subtle difference. There's actually a pretty big difference between being able to do anything that can be done and being able to do anything. Because one is actually way more powerful than the other. Because if you can do anything that can be done, that's pretty powerful. If you can do anything, even things that can't be done, that's ridiculously powerful. And then there's also questions about, God's capacity for knowledge. Can he know the future? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. Because if we have free will, God can't know what we might do, maybe. And then there's questions about God's goodness. What is that? What does he consider evil and good? So even if someone says, God, it's still lots of questions. That's why I'm super annoying on airplanes. That's why I tell people I'm a drug dealer, because they stop asking questions, except, you got me. That's just the next question. And I say, but of course. Well, yeah, because technically many things are perfectly legal are drugs, like caffeine and aspirin and so on. And opioids with a prescription. I mean, that's brilliant drug dealers. That's the way to deal drugs. Actually not, that's terrible. So question one is, what is the nature of God? Now once you answer that question, the second question can then be addressed. Does that being exist? So as we'll see when we look at our dead philosophers, they always begin by saying, what are we talking about? What do we mean by God? And does that exist? And of course, people like Thomas Aquinas and St. Anselm always say, yeah, that definitely exists. Now the second set of questions deal with epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with what we know, or can know, can't know. So the corresponding questions are, how do we know the nature of God? Which is a fair question, because people claim to know all kinds of things about God. What God wants us to do, who God wants us to marry, what God wants us to eat, how God feels about marriage, how God feels about, everything. and there are people who claim to have utter confidence about this. And so a fair question to ask someone, especially if they're killing other people who disagree with them, is how do they know? So if you have, people who want to impose their religious values on the people, claiming that this is God's view, a fair question to ask them is, well, how do they know? And people disagree. So good question is, how do they know this? Second question is, how do we know that God exists? Because he could have a definition of God, and we could say God exists, but a fair question is, how do we know that? What are the means of knowing? Now, when it comes to addressing these questions, there are basically, not surprisingly, two big schools. Things tend to split into teams. You get Republican versus Democrat, that type of stuff. So the two big teams in this question are people who say reason and logic can address these questions. The other team is they cannot. Now within the reason and logic team, there's two sub-teams, not surprisingly, because people always split up. And here are the two camps. One camp believes in what's called a priori reasoning. They're known as rationalists, because, rational. Now, what they believe is this. A priori reasoning is reason prior. Prior to what? Well, prior to experience. The idea is, roughly put, a priori reasoning is reasoning that you do, and you can, engage in this reasoning just by thinking about stuff. You don't have to look, you know just by thinking. Now, pretty much every philosopher does agree there is a priori reason. And again, my standard example is, like this. I've drawn a triangle on the board, I've covered it with my hands. How many sides does it have? Yeah, you know that by pure reason, because by definition, triangles have 3 sides. So everyone, well, almost everyone, except, there are some things you can know by pure reason. Mathematics, logic, etc. Now, what makes this special is people who believe you can prove the existence of things by pure reason, just by going through logical steps, without beginning with any empirical observation or experience. You can just, typically by definition, just work through a series of steps and then conclude that something exists. Now this includes our good dead friend St. Anselm, we'll look at, our good dead friend Descartes, we'll look at, and our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, we'll also look at. They all believed that by pure reason, you could prove God's existence. Now, there are also people who believe you can prove stuff not just about God, but other stuff by pure reason, prove that things exist. Now, the other camp, they're called the Empiricists. If a person's an empiricist and believes in God, they would believe that the only way you can prove God's existence, or if they're an atheist, disprove it, would be what's called a posteriori reasoning. And of course, posterior is, behind or after. In this case, of course, behind or after experience. Now, the empiricists, they believe that whatever you know about the world that exists, you ultimately have to draw back to the senses, seeing, hearing, etc. Now, you can, of course, use scientific instruments. So it doesn't have to be that you can actually just see yourself. So an empiricist wouldn't say, you can't see air, so it doesn't exist, because we can, measure the air, etc. They would also allow, things like radio telescopes, etc. But their view is the only way to prove or disprove something existing is by empirical reasoning. You obviously can use logic, etc., but it has to connect back to some observation. And this will include our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas, and on the opposing side, using this method to say, probably no God, but look at our good dead friend, David Hume.
Are they saying like, if you haven't seen any type of God, it don't exist?
Oh, they could say that, but they typically are willing to allow kind of indirect evidence. So, St. Aquinas doesn't claim to have seen God, but he says, if you look at, like, for example, one of his arguments is you look at the world around you, crudely put, it seems like it's been designed. So there must be a designer, therefore God exists, the designer. So it could be an indirect observation. Now the ideal thing, of course, would be like say, yep, getting a text from God, a phone number from God. But pretty much none of these philosophers claim to have directly seen God. Now some do claim mystical experience. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, gave up writing after he had a mystical experience. So they could accept, I guess the best one would be direct, empirical experience of God. But typically it's much more indirect. And of course some people do even argue that we couldn't even perceive God, or it just, destroyed us because it'd just be too much while we're alive. Okay, so these guys and gals take the view pure reason can prove God's existence, and these people take the view that if you're going to prove or disprove God, you got to start with empirical evidence of some type. Now, even rationalists believe that there are some things you would have to know empirically. So, for example, if you wondered where your car keys are, you couldn't use pure reason and deduce it. You'd have to check. I mean, you could go through a process of reasoning, I last saw them on the kitchen counter, so they're probably there, but it would trace back to an observation. But it's about, whether something exists or not. And this battle still persists to this day. There are people who still say they can prove God by pure reason, and other people say, no, you can't. You can only do it by empirical observation. And then, of course, there are those who say, there is no God, so you can't prove it, because we prove there is no God. Before going to our next exciting slide, anything about this? It needs more stuff. Now the second big camp, so camp one is, you can use reason and logic. There's the rationalist folks, the empiricist folks, and the other big camp is, reason and logic can't help you here. One approach is only through faith. You can't reason it out, you have to believe through faith. Second option is, it has to be done through not reasoning, but mystical experience, or divine revelation. You don't have to reason about it because you just, there's God, appears to you. Then there are those who claim that perhaps God exists, but you can't know God by any means at all, that somehow you should still believe. Or alternatively, some people may say, you can't know anything about God, so don't believe. There's also a unique view put forth by our good dead friend Blaise Pascal. He argues that you can't know God, and so you can't prove or disprove God's existence. But, and what puts him in this category, is he thinks that God is your best bet. So reason can't help you prove or disprove God, but reason shows you that that's how you should bet. So it's kind of a weird approach, but it does fall in this category, because he says you can't prove it, but that's how you should still bet. And then he died. Now, one question that arises is, what are some tools or methods you can use to argue about something as fundamental as God? Well, one thing we'll see when we look at our good dead friend Thomas Aquinas and others is a combination of some useful philosophical tools, namely the regress and what we've seen before, absurdity, which seems like a weird combination. They use regress and absurdity to prove things, but here's how it goes. Now, there are two basic types of regresses. And a regress, of course, is, roughly put, falling back. The first one, which we're all familiar with, is what's called a circular regress. The idea is this. It's a scenario where one thing depends on or requires another, but then eventually you go back to where you started. So the next to last thing requires a starting point. More formally, the simple one would be that A requires A. More elaborately, A requires B, B requires C, so on, until Z requires A, because you're back in a circle. Now, a concrete example is this one. Everyone's heard the line, you can't get a job without experience. You can't get experience without a job. Now, if that were true, it would be a circular regress, because it would be this. You can't get a job without experience, you can't get experience without a job, and so you can never break into the circle, because you don't have experience, so you can't get a job. You don't have a job, so you can't get experience, so you'd be forever trapped outside of the circle. And so a circular regress would be, they're always bad, because if you can show that something leads to a circular regress, it creates an impossible scenario. Now, a second type of regress is the infinite regress. Now, people who know geometry will point out, hey, circles are infinite, because they emit a number of points. And yes, that's true. But the infinite regress is one that's infinite, but not circular. Here's how this one goes. The idea is that 1 requires, it depends on 2, 2 requires 3, 3 requires 4, and so on to infinity and beyond. Now, if you end up in an infinite regress, the general idea is that these things are impossible scenarios. So if you show that something leads to infinite regress, then that's bad. So how do you use these as tools? I mean, how would you actually, use a circular regress, infinite regress, to try to prove or disprove anything? Well, that requires something we've seen before, but we'll review because it's so long ago. Is the reductio ad absurdum. Now, to illustrate the infinite regress, what would one look like? Well, imagine the following scenario. Suppose you go to get financial aid, and you go in and you say, I would like some financial aid. And the person smiles and says, but of course, we're from the government, we're here to help you. All you have to do to get the financial aid is to fill out this form for requesting financial aid. You're like, wow, thanks, can I have the form? But of course, we're from the government, we're here to help. In order to get the form for requesting financial aid, all you must do is fill out the form for requesting the form for requesting financial aid. You say, can I have the form for requesting the form for requesting financial aid? And they say, but of course, I'm here to help you from the government. All you have to do to get the form for requesting the form for requesting the form for requesting financial aid is to fill out the form for requesting the form for requesting the form for requesting the form for requesting financial aid. And for every form, there's another form you have to fill out to get that form, which means you get your money never. Because it's an infinite regress. It's an impossible scenario. Also a business model as well. So that's what infinite regress would look like. So how would you use one as a philosophical tool? Well, if we go back to the ancient days and the beginning time, we saw the method of reducing to absurdity, in Latin, reductio ad absurdum. And we saw there were two methods. One is you can assume something is true, show that that assumption leads to an absurdity, therefore it must be false. Or alternatively, if you want to show that something's true, you assume it's false, prove that this assumption leads to an impossibility or an absurdity, so conclude it's true. Now, an infinite regress or a circular regress is an impossibility. So if you can show that something leads to an infinite regress, ta-da, it's absurd. So these are like peanut butter and chocolate, philosophically speaking. So not really, that are, they go together very well. Now, some thinkers use these basically to be super annoying. For example, long ago in ancient Greece, there's a fellow named Parmenides, which sounds like a cheese, but is not. So if you're at a restaurant and they say, would you like some Parmenides on your pasta? I say no, because otherwise they'll be sprinkling dead philosopher on your pasta, and that would be pretty terrible. But Parmenides believed that everything stayed the same. Not like in the sense like same day, same crap. He meant literally there was no change. It's all an illusion. Everything is unchanging. Now, his student, this fellow named Zeno, who's actually more famous than Parmenides, he came up with a famous paradox of motion using the infinite regress to show that nothing moves. Here's the idea. Suppose we assume that stuff moves. Here's why this is impossible. Now, for me to get from here to the desk, I've got to cover half the distance, which is, of course, totally true. But, of course, to get half the distance to the desk, I've got to cover half of that distance, which is also totally true. But, of course, with any distance, you can keep cutting that in half. You keep dividing it by 2 forever. Which means that for me to get from here to the desk, I would have to cover an infinite distance, because each step would require an infinite number of steps, which means that I can never make it to the desk. Therefore, movement must be an illusion. So, infinite regress, reductio ad absurdum, proving that nothing moves. Which, of course, also shows there's probably something wrong with that reasoning, because stuff does seem to move. But you get to be famous and dead, so pretty good. Now, how do they use this type of reasoning when it comes to, like, God and stuff like that? Well, this method is also very useful, not just when you want to, like, create crazy paradoxes about motion, but if you want to talk about the origin of everything. And here's an example. And this will show how, by pure reason, you can prove things, seemingly very important things, very basic things. For example, given the infinite regress and reductio, I can easily prove, apparently, that there had to be a non-human origin to humans. How so? Well, here's how it goes. Now, suppose that every human had to have human parents. Now, at first, of course, that seems pretty reasonable, because every human you know has got human parents. And, of course, they have parents, and so on, so on. Now, this, however, can't go on forever, because if every parent has to have parents, that would mean you have an infinite regress, because you would need, get to, like, Adam and Eve, they would have to have parents, and their parents would have to have parents, and their parents would have to have parents, which would mean you need an infinite number of people. But do we have that many people? No. So that means that either we're not here, because it's impossible, or there was something that gave rise to humans that was not human. So just by using these two logical, methods, I've proven in simple steps that there had to be an origin to us that wasn't human, because otherwise we couldn't be here, but we are. So there was. Now, it doesn't tell us what that was. If you talk to people in evolutionary theory, they would say, well, some type of tree shrew, and that came from like some slime, and then of course you keep pushing the question back, where did that all come from? And they would say, a very big bang rose. People who believe in God, of course, would say, well, you trace it all back to God. Now, as you might imagine, given that illustration, this argument, this approach is commonly used to argue for God. Because anything you point to, you have to say, well, either it had to come from something else, in which case you need something else, or it didn't come from anything else, in which case it's the first thing that started everything. And so you pretty much end up with a first thing that started everything. There are other options, but that's the main deal. So pretty much most thinkers, if you talk to anybody, be it atheist or theist, and they thought about this stuff, they will most likely say, yeah, there had to be something that started everything, something that didn't come from anything else, because of the infinite regress problem. And where they fight is what that first thing was, God or whatever. Now the first person we'll look at is our good dead friend Saint Anselm, born in 1033, died in 1109, still very dead today, but a dead saint. So I guess if you're going to be dead, you might as well get like the premium dead option, which is being a saint. Now his goal was this. He believed that with deductive logic, he could prove all the truths of Christianity and sit down, with like an atheist or a pagan and show them the error of their ways in deductive logic. And his ultimate goal was to prove, in this case in particular, prove that God exists without any possibility of doubt. Now you may wonder, why would someone who already believes in God, why would they want to prove this? Well, one obvious practical reason is, does everyone believe in God? No. So if you really believe in God, you think that's the truth, you'd want to find a way that could convince anybody, that it'd be undeniable. And of course, if you want to get into the psychology of it, maybe even people who believe aren't completely certain, so they want to have certain proof to know for sure. So he created the ontological argument. Now, in terms of where we put our good dead friend Anselm, he's dead, obviously, but also he's in the a priori rationalist camp. He believes just by thinking about God, he can prove that God exists. It even goes beyond that. It's not enough that just like God exists, he's got to show that God cannot exist, that he must exist, and this only applies to God. So, again, kind of overkill. So how does he set this up? Well, what he has to put up as his foil, as his nemesis, as his enemy, is someone who doesn't believe in God. Now, that of course, during the time period when Anselm was Anselming, talking about like atheism and stuff would be kind of dangerous, because they burn people for believing the wrong things and saying the wrong things back then, or nailed them and stuff. So a common technique was this. If you're going to argue and bring up, a denial of God or church doctrine, you'd always refer to the person denying it as not you, but some fool denying God. So if you wonder, like, why is he talking about the fool? Well, he wants to make it clear that this is in no way his view, that it's only the fool saying this. Now, to get his thing going, to make it a priori, what he's going to do is go from his definition of the term God, and he believes that from that definition, he can prove God's existence. So how does he define it? Well, he defines it this way. A being than which nothing greater can be conceived, or NGCBC. I'll just call it God. But his idea is that if you can think of something, and then think of something greater, that thing is not God. Now, he doesn't mean like what I could think of, because maybe I can't think of anything really that great. He means that, it'd be impossible for infinite logic, infinite imagination to conceive of a being greater than that. Crudely put, the greatest of all beings. I mean, a better way to put it would be like, there's nothing greater. So the fool says there's no such thing, and we'll see next time how the fool is the fool, and God must exist. So have a good weekend. I'll see you all on Monday.